The man pointing the rifle at her chest said his name was Coulter Hayes, and he'd paid cash money for the right to marry her. Lillian Whitmore stood frozen on the Wyoming station platform, still wearing her threadbare Boston coat, watching this scarred stranger load her battered trunk onto a wagon without asking permission. She'd signed the papers 3 weeks ago with shaking hands and an empty stomach, trading her name for the promise of food and shelter somewhere far from the debt collectors. Now she understood the truth. She hadn't escaped anything. She'd just sold herself to a different kind of prison, one with blue eyes and a reputation the conductor had whispered about during the entire journey west. If you're still here, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see just how far this story travels. The train had smelled like sweat and coal smoke for 6 straight days. Lillian pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and watched the landscape change from crowded brick buildings to endless white nothing. Snow covered everything this far west. The hills, the fences, even the scattered bones of cattle that hadn't survived the previous winter. She'd stopped counting the unmarked graves along the tracks somewhere past Nebraska. Her fingers traced the edge of the folded contract in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the creases had worn soft. One mail-order bride sought for Wyoming territory. Room and board provided. Marriage immediate upon arrival. The advertisement had been printed in such small type she'd almost missed it, wedged between notices for factory work and questionable medical treatments. She'd answered it the same night the landlord nailed the eviction notice to her door. The woman sitting across from her hadn't stopped talking since Illinois. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said again, adjusting her fox fur collar. "A decent woman doesn't travel alone to marry a stranger. What kind of man can't find a wife the proper way?" Lillian didn't answer. She'd learned during the first 2 days that silence bothered the woman more than any argument could. The truth was simple enough. The kind of man who advertised for a bride was either desperate, damaged, or dangerous. Probably all three. But Lillian had 62 cents to her name and nowhere to return to even if she changed her mind. Boston held nothing but her dead mother's debts and the memory of her father's gambling that had destroyed them both. The conductor appeared at the end of the car, steadying himself against the rocking motion. "Fort Shepherd in 20 minutes, miss." Her stomach twisted. 20 minutes until she met the man whose name she'd agreed to take. Coulter Hayes. She'd tried to imagine him 100 different ways during the journey, fat and old, cruel and violent, sick with something contagious. The letters he'd sent had revealed almost nothing. His handwriting was surprisingly neat. He owned land. He raised cattle and horses. He needed help running the property. That was all. The train began to slow with a screech of brakes that set her teeth on edge. Through the window, she could see the station now. A rough wooden building that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind, surrounded by a handful of other structures that barely qualified as a town. Men stood on the platform in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, their breath making clouds in the frozen air. "Last chance to stay on this train," the talking woman said. "We'll be in California by Tuesday." Lillian stood and pulled down her trunk from the overhead rack. Everything she owned fit inside one battered piece of luggage. 3 dresses, her mother's Bible that she never opened anymore, a pair of broken reading glasses, and a photograph of her parents taken before the gambling started. The trunk wasn't even properly locked. The clasp had broken somewhere past Chicago. The train lurched to a complete stop. Outside, a man separated himself from the cluster of waiting people and moved toward the passenger car. Even through the dirty glass, Lillian could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat that hung past his knees. He walked with a slight limp. Her heart kicked against her ribs. The conductor helped her down the steps. The cold hit her face like a slap, stealing her breath. The platform was coated in ice, and she nearly slipped before catching herself on the railing. When she looked up, the man was standing directly in front of her. Coulter Hayes looked nothing like she'd imagined. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with weather-worn skin and pale blue eyes that seemed too calm for a place this wild. A scar cut through his right eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. Another traced the line of his jaw. His face had the kind of stillness that made her think of frozen water, smooth on the surface but impossible to read underneath. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Mr. Hayes." Her own voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He studied her for a long moment, his expression giving away nothing. Then he nodded once and moved past her to grab her trunk from where the conductor had set it down. He lifted it like it weighed nothing and carried it toward a wagon hitched to two large horses. Lillian stood on the platform, suddenly uncertain what she was supposed to do. Follow him? Wait? Introduce herself properly? The contract hadn't included instructions for this part. You coming? Coulter called back without turning around. She hurried after him, her worn boots slipping on the ice. When she reached the wagon, he was already securing her trunk in the back with rope. Up close, she could see his hands were scarred too. Old white lines across the knuckles, a burn mark near his left wrist. Working hands. Or fighting hands. Maybe both. It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch, he said, finishing the knot. Storm's coming in tonight, so we need to move. I should... Lillian started, then stopped. What should she do? Thank him for purchasing her like livestock? Apologize for being a disappointment? She could see in his face that she wasn't what he'd expected either. Coulter glanced at her, then away. You should get in the wagon. He didn't help her climb up. She managed it herself, settling onto the wooden bench seat that was still covered in a light dusting of snow. He swung up beside her a moment later, taking the reins in his scarred hands. The horses started forward without him saying a word, as if they knew the way by heart. The town disappeared behind them quickly. Within minutes, there was nothing but white emptiness in every direction. Flat plains that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the dark shapes of distant mountains. The wind picked up, cutting through Lillian's thin coat and making her shiver. Coulter reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He handed it to her without looking. Thank you, she said quietly. He grunted. They rode in silence for what felt like an hour. Lillian wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and tried not to think about what came next. Marriage to a stranger, a home she'd never seen, a life she couldn't begin to imagine. The cold made her nose run and her eyes water, but she was afraid to move too much in case it annoyed him. You get my letters? Coulter finally asked, his eyes still on the horizon. Yes. Read them? Of course. Then you know what you signed up for. Lillian swallowed hard. I know you own land. You raise cattle. And you needed someone to help run the property. That's it? She hesitated. That's what the letters said. Coulter's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might say something else, but he just shook his head slightly and kept driving. The wagon hit a rut in the frozen road and she grabbed the edge of the seat to steady herself. Her fingers were going numb despite the blanket. You married before? He asked suddenly. No. Engaged? No. Any men back in Boston waiting for you to change your mind? No. She turned to look at him directly. There's nothing in Boston for me at all. That's why I answered your advertisement. His expression didn't change. Fair enough. More silence. The wind grew stronger, howling across the empty plains. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, until the mountains ahead disappeared into white haze. Coulter didn't seem concerned. He just kept the horses moving at the same steady pace, his shoulders hunched slightly against the cold. What about you? Lillian heard herself ask. Were you married before? No. So why? She stopped herself, but it was too late. Why'd I advertise for a bride instead of courting someone local? Coulter finished. His voice had gone flat. You really want to know? I think I should. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, Women in town won't have me. Haven't for years. Heard I was dead for a while. Heard I was locked up. Heard a lot of things, most of them true. When I came back and settled on the ranch, nobody wanted anything to do with me. So I placed the advertisement. Lillian's chest tightened. What things did they hear? Nothing you need to worry about. You signed the contract. That's what matters. If I'm going to marry you, you already agreed to marry me. He finally looked at her, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. Not anger, something colder. Papers are signed. You took my money for the train ticket. Wedding's tomorrow morning at the ranch. Preacher's already arranged. The snow was falling so thick now, she could barely see the horses' heads. The wagon lurched over another frozen rut, and she grabbed Coulter's arm without thinking. His muscles were solid as stone beneath the coat. He glanced down at her hand, then back at the road. "You scared?" he asked. She wanted to lie, but what was the point? "Yes." "Good. Shows you've got sense." He shifted the reins to one hand and pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders with the other. "Ranch is just over the next rise. Fire's already going. You'll warm up." The next rise turned out to be 20 more minutes of brutal wind and blinding snow. By the time the buildings finally appeared through the white haze, Lillian's entire body was shaking with cold. The ranch wasn't what she'd expected. There was a low cabin made of dark wood and stone, a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals that seemed to stretch forever into the storm. Everything looked solid and well-built, nothing like the ramshackle structures in town. Coulter pulled the wagon up near the cabin and set the brake. Before Lillian could move, he jumped down and come around to her side. This time he did help, reaching up to lift her by the waist and set her on the ground like she weighed nothing. His hands were impersonal, but steady. "Go inside," he said. "I'll get your trunk." The cabin door wasn't locked. Lillian pushed it open and stumbled into warmth that hit her like a wall. A fire burned in a large stone fireplace, filling the single room with flickering orange light. The space was sparse but clean. A table with 2 chairs, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, a narrow bed in the corner, and not much else. No curtains on the windows. No decoration on the walls. Nothing soft or welcoming. It looked like exactly what it was. A place where a man lived alone. The door opened behind her and Coulter came in carrying her trunk. He set it down near the bed, then moved to the fireplace to add more wood. Snow melted off his hat and coat, dripping onto the floor. "Hungry?" he asked, without turning around. "A little." "There's bread in the cupboard. Coffee's still hot." He straightened and finally looked at her directly. "You should eat something. It's been a long trip." Lillian nodded but didn't move. She was suddenly aware of how small the cabin was, how there was only one bed, how this man was now legally entitled to expect things from her she wasn't ready to think about. Coulter seemed to read her thoughts. His expression softened slightly. Not much, but enough to make him look less like a stranger who'd purchased her. "You'll sleep in the bed," he said quietly. "I'll take the floor until after the wedding. That's how it'll be." Relief made her dizzy. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for basic decency." He moved toward the door, pulling his hat back on. "I need to check on the horses. Eat, rest. We'll talk more in the morning." Then he was gone, and Lillian was alone in the cabin that would apparently become her home. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. Her wet clothes clung to her skin. Her fingers were still numb. Everything smelled like wood smoke and leather and something else she couldn't name, something that belonged to him. She found the bread in the cupboard, half a loaf that was only slightly stale. The coffee was thick and bitter, but hot enough to burn her throat going down. She ate standing up, too nervous to sit, too tired to do anything productive. Through the window, she could see Coulter moving between the barn and the cabin, carrying something she couldn't make out through the snow. What had she done? The question circled in her mind like a wolf. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who frightened her, in a place that felt like the edge of the world, with no money and no way to escape even if she wanted to. The women in town wouldn't have him. That's what he'd said. Why? What had he done that made them refuse him? The door opened again and Coulter came back in, his coat covered in snow. He hung it on a peg near the door, then his hat, then the gun belt she hadn't noticed before. The revolver in the holster looked well used, very well used. "Storm's getting worse," he said, moving to the fire. "We're snowed in until at least tomorrow afternoon." Lillian's stomach dropped. "But the preacher, he's not coming through this weather. Wedding will have to wait a day or two." She didn't know whether to feel relieved or more frightened. "What do we do until then?" Coulter glanced at her, and for the first time something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "We try not to drive each other crazy in a 10 by 15 cabin. That's what we do." He pulled off his boots and set them near the fire to dry, then settled into one of the chairs with a heavy sigh. The firelight caught the scars on his face, making them stand out like dark rivers. He looked exhausted. He looked dangerous. He looked like a man carrying weight she couldn't see. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "It's late." "What about you?" "I'll keep the fire going. Sleep when I'm tired." Lillian wanted to argue, but her body was already shutting down. The warmth, the food, the endless days of travel, everything caught up with her at once. She moved to the bed and sat down on the edge, unlacing her boots with clumsy fingers. The mattress felt like heaven compared to the train seats. She lay down fully clothed, pulling the rough wool blanket over herself. From this angle, she could see Coulter silhouetted against the fire, perfectly still except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing, watching over her or guarding her. She wasn't sure which. "Mr. Hayes?" she whispered. "Yeah?" "Were you really dead, like they said in town?" Long silence. Then, "For a while, yes, I think I was." She wanted to ask what that meant, but sleep pulled her under before she could form the words. Tank. Lillian woke to the smell of frying bacon and weak gray light coming through the windows. For a confused moment, she thought she was still in Boston, in her mother's cramped apartment, before the memories crashed back. Wyoming. The cabin. The stranger she'd agreed to marry. She sat up quickly and found Coulter at the stove, working a cast-iron pan with practiced efficiency. He'd already been outside. His coat was wet, his hair dark with melted snow. The fire blazed in the hearth. The storm outside had died down to a light snowfall. "Morning," he said without turning around. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up." Lillian's face burned. She'd slept in her clothes, her hair was a disaster, and she probably smelled terrible after 6 days on a train. She found the basin near the door, cold water, but clean, and did her best to make herself presentable. When she turned back, Coulter had set 2 plates on the table. "Sit," he said. The bacon was crispy and salty, the eggs cooked perfectly, the coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Lillian ate slowly, watching him across the table. In daylight, he looked older than she'd thought. Closer to 40, maybe, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into too many harsh suns. His hands moved with unconscious grace as he ate, like a man comfortable with his body despite the scars. "Storm's past," he said between bites. "Roads should be clear by tonight. Preacher can come through tomorrow morning." "Oh." Lillian set down her fork. "Then we'll get married." "Yeah." He looked up at her. "Unless you changed your mind." "Can I change my mind?" His jaw tightened. "Contract says no, but I'm not going to force you into anything. If you want to leave, I'll take you back to town when the road's clear. Give you enough money to get somewhere else." Lillian studied his face, looking for the lie. "Why would you do that? You already paid for my ticket. Made all the arrangements." "Because I need a wife, not a prisoner." Coulter pushed his plate away. "I was honest in the letters. I need help running this place. I'm tired of living alone, but if you're scared of me, if you think I'm going to hurt you, then this won't work. Better to find out now." "Are you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Going to hurt me?" Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, but something deeper and more complicated. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you. That's a promise." "Why should I believe you?" "You shouldn't. You don't know me." He stood and carried his plate to the basin. "But you're here anyway. That means you're either brave or desperate or both. So am I. Maybe that's enough to start with." Lillian watched him scrub the plate clean with sharp, efficient movements. His shoulders were tense under his shirt, his posture rigid. He was nervous, she realized. This hard, scarred man who'd lived alone in the wilderness, he was just as uncertain about this arrangement as she was. "I haven't changed my mind," she heard herself say. "I'll marry you tomorrow, like we agreed." He turned, meeting her eyes. "You sure?" "No. But I don't have anywhere else to go, and you need help, and maybe that is enough to start with." She stood as well, smoothing down her wrinkled dress. "You should know something, though. I don't know anything about ranching, or horses, or cooking for more than one person. I can read and write and do basic arithmetic, but that's about it. If you're expecting some frontier woman who knows how to... I'm not expecting anything," Coulter interrupted, "except honesty. You give me that, I'll give it back. We'll figure out the rest." All right. They stood there in awkward silence until Coulter finally cleared his throat. "I need to check the cattle. You can stay inside where it's warm. There's books on the shelf if you want something to do." "I could help?" He raised an eyebrow. Help? You said you needed help running this place. I should start learning. For the first time since she'd met him, Coulter almost smiled. Almost. It's cold out there. You don't have proper clothes. I'll manage. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Get your coat. And those gloves in the trunk by the door. They might fit you. The gloves were too big, but they were lined with fur and warmer than anything Lillian owned. Coulter found her a wool scarf that smelled like leather and horses, and a hat that covered her ears. By the time they stepped outside, she was wrapped up like a package. The world was blinding white. Snow covered everything at least 2 feet deep, transforming the landscape into something from a dream. The cold stole her breath immediately, burning in her lungs. Beside her, Coulter moved through it like it was nothing, his long legs cutting a path toward the barn. Stay close, he said over his shoulder. Easy to get turned around in conditions like this. The barn was warmer than outside, but still cold enough to see her breath. Horses stamped in their stalls, shaking their manes. The smell of hay and manure was overwhelming at first, then strangely comforting. Coulter moved down the line, checking each animal with quick, practiced efficiency. This is Smoke, he said, stopping at a large gray gelding. Steadiest horse I've got. When you're ready to learn to ride, he's who you'll start with. Lillian reached out tentatively and touched the horse's nose. Smoke huffed warm air against her palm. He likes you, Coulter said. That's good. They checked the other horses, then the cattle in the far paddock, big, shaggy beasts that looked mean, but mostly just stood there chewing and staring. Coulter counted them twice, his lips moving silently. 43 head. He explained what each one was worth, what they'd fetch at market, how many would need to be culled before spring. Lillian tried to follow, but most of it went over her head. It's a lot to learn, Coulter said, as if reading her mind. Don't worry about remembering everything now. Just watch. Ask questions when you have them. How long have you had this ranch? 3 years. Built most of it myself. By yourself? Had help the first year. After that, people stopped coming around. He moved toward the door and, come on. I need to check the feed supplies. They spent the next 2 hours working side by side. Coulter showed her how to measure out grain for the horses, how to break ice in the water troughs, how to check the barn roof for damage from the storm. He was patient but not condescending, explaining things once and expecting her to pay attention. When she slipped on a patch of ice, he caught her arm without comment and kept walking. By the time they returned to the cabin, Lillian's feet were numb and her legs ached. But she also felt strangely proud. She'd helped. She'd been useful. It was a small thing, but it mattered. You did good, Coulter said, hanging his coat by the door. Better than I expected for a city girl. I'm tougher than I look. I'm starting to see that. He made lunch, bread and cheese and cured meat, and they ate in companionable silence. The awkwardness from the morning had faded slightly. They were still strangers, but maybe slightly less so. Lillian studied him when she thought he wasn't looking, memorizing the details. The scar through his eyebrow, the way his hands moved, the unconscious wariness in his posture, like a man always ready to fight. What? Coulter asked, catching her staring. Nothing. I'm just trying to figure you out. Good luck with that. But his tone was softer than the words. Most people give up eventually. I'm stubborn. Me too. This should be interesting. The afternoon passed quickly. Coulter taught her how to properly tend the fire, how to read the weather by the sky, how to tell which logs were dry enough to burn. He showed her where he kept the emergency supplies, matches, candles, ammunition, medicine. The gun belt went on a high shelf, out of casual reach but close enough to grab if needed. You know how to shoot? He asked. No? I'll teach you. Every woman out here should know. Why? Coulter didn't answer right away. He moved to the window and stared out at the white landscape. Because it's a hard place. Beautiful, but hard. Things happen. People get hurt. I won't always be here. You need to be able to protect yourself. There was something in his voice that made her skin prickle. What things happen? Nothing you need to worry about right now. But, let it go, Lillian. It was the first time he'd used her first name. The sound of it in his low, rough voice did something strange to her chest. She wanted to push him, to demand answers, but the set of his shoulders told her it would be useless. Whatever secrets he carried, he wasn't ready to share them yet. That night, they fell into an uneasy routine. Coulter made dinner, some venison stew that was surprisingly good, while Lillian set the table and tried to remember everything she'd learned that day. After eating, they sat by the fire while he sharpened a knife and she attempted to read one of his books. The words swam on the page. She was too aware of him, of the quiet scrape of blade on stone, of the way the firelight caught in his pale eyes. "You can ask, you know," he said suddenly. "Ask what? Whatever it is you're thinking so loud about." Lillian closed the book. "The women in town. What you said about them not wanting anything to do with you. What did you do?" Coulter stopped sharpening. For a moment she thought he might tell her to mind her business. Then he set down the knife and leaned back in his chair, his face half in shadow. "I killed men," he said flatly. "A lot of them. That's what I did." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lillian's heart kicked against her ribs. "Why?" "Because I was good at it. Because people paid me to do it. Because I didn't know how to do anything else." He looked at her directly. "I was what they call a gunfighter, a hired gun. Someone wanted a problem solved. They came to me. I solved it, no questions asked." "But you stopped." "I stopped. Came here. Built this ranch. Tried to become someone different." His jaw tightened. "Doesn't change what I was. Doesn't change the things I did. The people in town remember. They'll always remember." Lillian should have been terrified. She should have run for the door and demanded he take her back to Fort Shepherd immediately. But something in his face stopped her. The exhaustion there, the weight of old guilt, the desperate hope that maybe he could be someone else. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Every day? But regret doesn't bring anyone back. It just sits there eating at you." "Then why tell me?" "Because you're about to marry me. You deserve to know who you're tying yourself to." He picked up the knife again but didn't start sharpening. "If you want to leave, say so now. I meant what I said. I'll take you to town, give you money, no hard feelings." Lillian thought about Boston, the empty apartment, the debt collectors, the slow starvation of spirit that came from being completely alone in the world. Then she thought about this rough cabin, this scarred man, this hard place where maybe she could become someone different too. "I'm not leaving," she said. Coulter's eyes searched her face. "Why not? You should be smart enough to be scared." "I am scared, but I'm also tired of running, and maybe—" She stopped, surprised by her own words. "Maybe we both deserve a second chance." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Maybe we do." They sat in silence after that, the fire burning low, the night pressing against the windows. Lillian eventually went to bed while Coulter stayed in his chair, keeping watch over nothing. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and the crackle of flames and the quiet sounds of the man who would become her husband tomorrow. She'd come west expecting a monster. What she'd found was something more complicated, something broken and trying to heal, something that made her think maybe broken things could still be worth fighting for. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Coulter's silhouette against the fire, perfectly still, like a guardian carved from stone. Tomorrow they would marry. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, in this moment, they were just two people trying to survive their own histories, and somehow, against all reason, that felt like enough. The preacher arrived just after dawn, riding a mule through snow that came up to his knees. Lillian watched from the window as Coulter walked out to meet him, the two men shaking hands like old acquaintances who'd rather not be. The preacher was older than she'd expected, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier hardship to be shocked by anything anymore. "Miss Whitmore," he said when he came inside, stomping snow off his boots. "I'm Reverend Mackey. I understand you're here to be married." "Yes, sir." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked her over with the kind of assessment that made her want to stand straighter. "You sure about this? It's not too late to change your mind. I can take you back to town, help you find proper work." Coulter stood by the door, his face unreadable. He didn't say anything, didn't pressure her, just waited. "I'm sure," Lillian said. Mackey sighed. "All right then, let's get on with it." The ceremony took less than 5 minutes. They stood in front of the fireplace while Mackey read from a worn Bible, his words flat and businesslike. There were no flowers, no guests, no music. just the crackle of flames and the howl of wind outside. When it came time for the vows, Coulter's voice was steady and his eyes never left her face. Lillian's hand shook so badly she could barely slide the plain gold band onto his finger. "You may kiss your bride," Mackie said, snapping the Bible shut. Coulter hesitated. Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. Brief, careful, almost formal. His mouth was warm. The kiss lasted maybe 2 seconds before he pulled back, but Lillian's heart was hammering like she'd run a mile. "Congratulations," Mackie said without enthusiasm. "You're married. That'll be $10. Coulter paid him in cash. The preacher counted it twice, then tucked it into his coat and headed for the door. "I'll file the paperwork when I get back to town. You two take care of each other." Then he was gone, and Lillian was alone with her husband. The word felt strange in her mind. Husband. This scarred stranger who'd just promised to honor her in front of a man neither of them really knew. Coulter moved to the stove and poured coffee like nothing had changed, but she could see tension in the line of his shoulders. "Well," he said finally, "that's done." "Yes." "You want breakfast?" She almost laughed. They'd just gotten married, and he was asking about breakfast like it was any other morning. "Sure." They ate in silence, eggs and the last of the bacon, neither one looking directly at the other. When they finished, Coulter cleared the plates and stood there for a moment, his hands braced on the edge of the basin. "I need to ride out to the north pasture," he said. "Check on the herd. Might be gone most of the day." Lillian understood what he was doing, giving her space, giving them both time to adjust to this new reality. "I'll be fine here. There's chores if you want something to do. Firewood needs stacking. Water barrel's getting low." He grabbed his coat from the peg. "Don't go wandering too far from the cabin. Easy to get lost if you don't know the land." "I won't." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "Lillian?" "Yes?" "I know this isn't what either of us pictured, but I'll do right by you. I promise." Before she could respond, he was gone. She watched through the window as he saddled one of the horses and rode north, his figure growing smaller until the landscape swallowed him completely. Then she was truly alone for the first time since arriving. The cabin felt bigger without him in it, emptier. She stood in the middle of the single room and tried to imagine her life here. Years of mornings like this one, years of waiting for a man to come back from places she didn't understand, years of trying to build something real out of a transaction that had started with desperation on both sides. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it just made her tired. She spent the morning doing the chores Coulter had mentioned. Stacking firewood turned out to be harder than it looked. The logs were heavy and didn't want to balance properly. She dropped one on her foot and had to sit down for 10 minutes until the pain faded to a dull throb. Filling the water barrel meant making 6 trips to the pump behind the cabin, her arms burning by the third. By noon, she was exhausted and her hands were covered in splinters. But the work felt good, real, like she was actually contributing instead of just being cargo that had been delivered. She made herself lunch from what she could find in the cupboard, bread and dried fruit and cheese that was harder than it should be. While she ate, she explored the cabin more thoroughly. There wasn't much to see. A shelf of books, most of them about ranching or animal husbandry. A trunk in the corner that held spare clothes and blankets. A rifle mounted above the door that looked well-maintained. Everything was practical, functional, stripped of anything that might be called decoration. In a small wooden box on the shelf, she found a tintype photograph. 2 young men stood side by side, both wearing Confederate gray, both looking grim. One of them was clearly Coulter, younger, unscarred, with eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide everything. The other man looked similar enough to be a brother. Lillian was still holding the photograph when the door burst open. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood in the doorway. Not Coulter. This man was older, heavier, with a thick beard and small eyes that went wide when he saw her. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "I'm—" Lillian's voice failed. She set down the photograph with shaking hands. "I'm Mrs. Hayes." "Mrs. Hayes?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Coulter went and got himself married. That's rich." He stepped inside without invitation, tracking snow across the floor. "Where is he?" "Out checking the herd." Course he is. The man moved closer and Lillian caught the smell of whiskey. I'm Monroe. I ranch about 10 miles east. Me and Coulter go way back. He tell you about me? No. No, I bet he didn't. Coulter's not much for talking about the old days. Monroe grabbed one of the chairs and sat down heavily. So you're the mail-order bride. Heard about that. Whole town's been talking. Lillian stayed by the shelf, keeping the table between them. I don't know when he'll be back. That's fine. I can wait. Monroe pulled a flask from his coat and took a long drink. You know what you married into, girl? I know enough. Do you? You know how many men he killed? Monroe leaned forward. I was there for some of it. Saw him shoot 3 men in Abilene without batting an eye. Fast as lightning and twice as mean. That's what they used to say about Coulter Hayes. He told me about his past. Did he tell you about Boone Mercer? The name meant nothing to Lillian, but something in Monroe's tone made her skin prickle. No, course not. Monroe took another drink. Boone's brother ran guns during the war, made a fortune selling to both sides. After the war ended, he kept at it, selling to Indians, outlaws, anyone with cash. Coulter was hired to stop him, caught up with him outside Santa Fe and put 2 bullets in his chest. Problem is, Boone never forgot. He's been hunting Coulter ever since. Lillian's hands had gone cold. How long ago was this? 6, maybe 7 years. But Boone's patient, and he's got money. Men like that don't forget, and they don't forgive. Monroe stood up, swaying slightly. You should know what you're in for. Could be men show up here looking for Coulter. Could be they don't care if a wife gets caught in the crossfire. Why are you telling me this? Because I liked you better when you were just a rumor. He moved toward the door, then stopped. You seem like a decent woman. Don't deserve to die for something you had no part in. If I were you, I'd get on the next train east before trouble finds this place. Then he was gone, leaving the door open and cold air rushing in. Lillian stood frozen for a long moment before her legs would move. She shut the door and leaned against it, her breath coming in short gasps. Boone Mercer. Men with guns. Crossfire. She thought about the rifle above the door, the ammunition Coulter kept in careful supply, the way he always seemed to be watching for something, even when there was nothing to see. When Coulter finally returned just before sunset, she was waiting at the table with the tintype photograph laid out in front of her. He saw it the moment he walked in, and his whole body went rigid. Where did you get that? His voice was quiet, dangerous. From the box on the shelf. I wasn't snooping, I was just... Who's the other man? She cut him off, pointing at the photograph. In the picture with you. Coulter hung up his coat slowly, not looking at her. My brother, James. Where is he now? Dead. Died during the war. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago. He moved to the stove and poured himself coffee, his movements stiff. Something happened while I was gone? A man named Monroe was here. Coulter's hand tightened on the cup. What did he say? He told me about Boone Mercer, about men who might come looking for you. Lillian stood up. He said I should leave before I get caught in the crossfire. Is he right? Is that why you really needed a wife? So you'd have someone here when... No. Coulter set down the cup hard enough to slap coffee onto the table. That's not why. Monroe's drunk half the time and paranoid the rest. He's got no business coming here and scaring you. So there's no Boone Mercer. Coulter's jaw worked. There's a Boone Mercer, but he's not coming here. That was years ago. He's probably forgotten all about it by now. Monroe said men like that don't forget. Monroe doesn't know what he's talking about. Then tell me what you know. Lillian moved around the table to face him directly. I'm your wife now. If there's danger coming, I deserve to know about it. There's no dangers. Then why do you keep a loaded rifle above the door? Why do you have enough ammunition to fight a war? Why do you look over your shoulder every time we're outside? Coulter stared at her, and for a moment she thought he might actually tell her the truth. Then his expression closed down like a door slamming shut. Because it's smart to be prepared out here, that's all. Monroe's stirring up old ghosts because he's got nothing better to do. I don't believe you. That's your choice. They stood there in tense silence, neither one willing to back down. Finally, Coulter moved past her to the fireplace, adding logs with sharp, angry movements. You want to leave? Fine. I'll take you to town tomorrow. Give you money like I said, but I'm not going to stand here and justify myself to someone who's known me for 3 days. The words stung more than they should have. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself. I don't want to leave. Then drop it. I just want to understand. I said drop it, Lillian. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her take a step back. You want to know the truth? Yes. I've made enemies. Yes, there's a chance someone might come looking for me someday. But marrying you wasn't about having a human shield. It was about trying to build something normal, something that might make this place feel less like a tomb. If you can't accept that without demanding my whole bloody history, then maybe Monroe was right, and you should get out while you still can. The silence that followed felt like broken glass. Lillian's throat was tight. She'd pushed too hard too fast, and now everything between them felt fractured. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to. Forget it. Coulter moved toward the door again. I need to check on the horses. Coulter, wait. But he was already gone, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Lillian stood alone in the cabin, fighting back tears she refused to let fall. This was her wedding day, and she'd spent it arguing with a man who clearly regretted bringing her here at all. She sat down at the table and put her head in her hands. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the promise of another storm. Inside, the fire burned low, and the cabin grew cold. Lillian eventually forced herself to move, adding wood to the fireplace and lighting candles against the growing darkness. She made dinner even though she had no appetite. Beans and salt pork, simple food that required no thought. Coulter didn't come back. An hour passed. Then 2. The wind grew stronger, howling around the corners of the cabin. Snow began to fall again, heavy flakes that caught in the lamplight from the window. Lillian stood at the door, peering into the darkness, her chest tight with worry. What if something had happened to him? What if he'd slipped on ice or gotten kicked by a horse? Or the door opened and Coulter came in, covered in snow, his face raw from the cold. He didn't look at her, just hung up his coat and moved to the fire, holding his hands out to the flames. I made dinner, Lillian said. If you're hungry. Not really. You should eat something anyway. I said I'm not hungry. She wanted to argue, but bit her tongue. Instead, she fixed a plate and set it on the table, then returned to her chair with her own untouched food. They sat in silence, the tension between them like a third presence in the room. Finally, Coulter sighed. I'm sorry for snapping at you earlier. Lillian looked up, surprised. I pushed too hard. Maybe, but you had a right to ask. He picked up his fork but didn't eat. Monroe shouldn't have come here, shouldn't have said those things, but he wasn't entirely wrong either. About Boone Mercer? Coulter nodded slowly. I killed his brother, shot him twice, like Monroe said. The man was dealing guns to renegade bands that were killing settlers. Someone had to stop him. I was hired to do it, and I did. He finally met her eyes. Boone swore he'd kill me for it. Sent word through half the territory. That was 6 years ago. Haven't seen or heard from him since. Maybe he gave up. Maybe he's dead. Maybe he's just waiting. I don't know. And you didn't think I should know this before I married you? Would it have changed your mind? Lillian thought about it honestly. Probably not. Then what difference does it make? The difference is trust. If we're going to make this work, she stopped, correcting herself. If I'm going to stay here, I need to know what I'm up against. All of it. Not just the parts you think I can handle. Coulter was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. My brother James died at Shiloh. Got shot in the gut and bled out over 3 days while I held his hand. Couldn't do anything to help him, just watched him die. He stared at the plate in front of him. After that, I didn't care much about living. Took jobs nobody else would take. Fought men nobody else would fight. Got good at killing because I was already dead inside. By the time I realized I wanted to survive, I'd made too many enemies to count. But you're trying to change. Trying doesn't mean succeeding. There's always a chance the past catches up. That's why I keep the rifle loaded. That's why I watch. Not because I'm expecting trouble tomorrow or next week, but because out here, eventually, everything comes home. Lillian absorbed this slowly. Why build the ranch at all then? Why not just keep moving? Because I got tired of running, tired of being that person. He finally took a bite of food, chewing mechanically. Figured if I could build something, put down roots, maybe I could prove I was more than the worst things I'd done. The ranch was supposed to be proof. And then you needed a wife to complete the picture. No. Coulter looked at her sharply. I needed a wife because I was lonely, because this place felt empty, because I wanted someone to talk to at night besides myself. You weren't part of some plan. You were just... He stopped, searching for words. A hope. That maybe someone could look at me and not see a killer. Something shifted in Lillian's chest. She thought about her own reasons for coming here, her own desperate hope that she could be someone different in a place where nobody knew her history. Maybe they weren't so different after all. I don't see a killer, she said quietly. You don't know me well enough yet. Maybe not. But I know you could have lied to me, could have hidden all of this. Instead, you told me the truth, even knowing I might leave. She reached across the table and touched his scarred hand. That means something. Coulter stared at her hand on his like he didn't know what to do with the gesture. Then, carefully, he turned his palm up and folded his fingers around hers. His hand was rough and warm and steady. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Be married, be someone's husband. I'm going to get it wrong a lot. So will I. We're quite a pair. We really are. For the first time since the argument, something almost like a smile crossed his face. They sat there holding hands across the table while the storm raged outside and the fire burned low and everything felt tentative, but somehow possible. That night, Coulter moved his bedroll from the floor to the other side of the bed. Not touching her, but close enough that she could hear him breathing in the darkness. It felt like progress, like maybe they were building towards something real instead of just surviving separate loneliness under the same roof. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Coulter would wake before dawn and tend to the animals while Lillian got the fire going and made breakfast. They'd eat together, not saying much, but the silence felt less strained. Then he'd head out to work the ranch and she'd tackle whatever chores she could manage. She learned quickly that frontier life was harder than anything she'd experienced in Boston. Her hands blistered from hauling water and chopping vegetables. Her back ached from bending over the washtub. Her shoulders burned from carrying firewood. Every night she collapsed into bed exhausted, and every morning she woke up and did it all again. But she also learned that she was stronger than she'd thought. The blisters turned to calluses, the aches faded into muscle. She figured out how to make bread that didn't turn out like rocks, how to get the stove hot enough without smoking up the whole cabin, how to tell when Coulter needed coffee and when he needed silence. He taught her to ride, starting with short trips around the property on Smoke. The first time she climbed into the saddle, her legs shook so badly she nearly fell off. By the end of the week, she could manage a trot without panicking. By the end of 2 weeks, she could ride out to the north pasture and back without getting lost. You're a natural, Coulter said one afternoon, watching her dismount without stumbling. Liar. I still can't get him to do what I want half the time. That's because you're asking instead of telling. Horses need confidence. He adjusted the stirrup on his own saddle. You'll get there. They were standing by the barn, the late afternoon sun turning everything gold. Lillian brushed hay off her skirt and tried not to think about how domestic this felt, how easy it was starting to become. She'd been at the ranch for almost a month now, a month of learning to live with this quiet, damaged man who treated her with careful respect and never asked for more than she was ready to give. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Why haven't you... She hesitated, feeling her face heat. We've been married a month, and you still sleep on the far side of the bed like there's a wall between us. Coulter's expression went carefully neutral. You want me to move closer? I'm asking why you haven't tried. Because you didn't come here for that. You came here because you needed a place to go. I'm not going to pressure you into something you're not ready for just because we signed papers. What if I am ready? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw heat flash in his pale eyes before he got it under control. Are you? Lillian's heart was hammering. I don't know. Maybe, She made herself say it. I want this to be real, not just a business arrangement. It is real. You know what I mean? Coulter stepped closer and suddenly the air between them felt charged. I know exactly what you mean, but I also know you're still figuring out if you can trust me. If I push too fast, I'll ruin whatever we're building here. His voice dropped lower. When it happens, I want you to be sure. Not just willing, sure. The words made something warm bloom in her chest. She reached up and touched the scar on his jaw, feeling him go very still under her fingers. You're a better man than you think you are. Or a more patient one. That too. He caught her hand and pressed it against his face for a moment, his eyes closing. Then he let her go and stepped back, putting safe distance between them again. Come on, we should get dinner started. They walked back to the cabin together as the sun set and the temperature dropped. That night Lillian lay awake, listening to Coulter breathe in the darkness, and thought about what it meant to choose someone. Really choose them, not just accept them because there were no other options. She was still thinking about it when she finally fell asleep. 2 weeks later, the spring thaw began. Ice on the creek started breaking up with sharp cracks that echoed across the valley. Snow melted into mud that turned the roads into impassable rivers of brown slush. The ranch felt like an island, cut off from the rest of the territory until the ground dried out enough for travel. Lillian didn't mind the isolation. She'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of their days, with the quiet intimacy of sharing coffee in the morning, and the way Coulter would sometimes reach for her hand when they sat by the fire at night. They hadn't crossed the final boundary between them yet, but she felt it coming closer with every passing day. She was hanging wet laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching. Not just one or two. Several, moving fast. Her hand stilled on the shirt she'd been pinning up, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. Coulter appeared from the barn, his posture instantly alert. He'd heard it too. His hand dropped to the revolver on his hip in a movement so automatic it looked like breathing. Get inside, he said quietly. What's happening? Inside, now! The tone in his voice made her move. She dropped the wet shirt back in the basket and hurried toward the cabin, but she stopped at the door to watch. 4 riders came over the ridge, their horses throwing mud with every step. Even from a distance, she could see they weren't friendly visitors. They rode spread out, strategic, like men who knew what they were doing. Coulter walked out to meet them, his hand still resting on his gun. Lillian's chest tightened. She should go inside like he'd told her to, but her feet wouldn't move. The riders pulled up about 20 feet from where Coulter stood. The man in front was massive, barrel-chested, with a black beard shot through with gray. His eyes were small and mean, and when he smiled, it looked like something carved into his face with a knife. Coulter Hayes, the man said. Been a long time. Not long enough, Boone. The name hit Lillian like a fist. Boone Mercer, the man Monroe had warned her about, the brother of the gun dealer Coulter had killed. She pressed her hand against the doorframe to steady herself. Heard you got yourself married, Boone continued, his eyes sliding past Coulter to land on Lillian. That the pretty little wife. She know what kind of man she's shackled to? State your business or ride on, Coulter said flatly. My business is you. Boone shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his own weapon. 6 years I've been looking for you. 6 years. You killed my brother in cold blood and disappeared like a coward. Now I find out you've been playing rancher this whole time, pretending to be respectable. Your brother was selling guns to renegades who killed families. Someone had to stop him. You murdered him. I did a job I was paid to do. Same as I did 100 other jobs. You want revenge for every man I ever put down, you'll need to take a number. One of the other riders laughed, short and harsh. Boone's face darkened. You think this is funny? You think I rode all the way out here for conversation? I think you rode out here to make a point, so make it and go. The point is this. Boone leaned forward in his saddle. I'm giving you a choice. You can face me like a man, just you and me. No one else gets hurt. Or I can burn this place to the ground with you and your pretty wife inside. Either way, you're dying today. The only question is whether she dies with you. Lillian's blood turned to ice. She started to move toward Coulter, but he held up one hand without looking at her. A clear signal to stay back. Leave her out of this, Coulter said, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous. She's got nothing to do with what happened between us. She married you. That makes her part of it. Boone's smile widened. What do you say, Hayes? You man enough to draw on me, or should I have my boys start with the barn? The 3 other riders spread out wider, their hands moving to their weapons. Lillian realized with horror that they'd surrounded Coulter, creating a killing zone with him in the center. If shooting started, he wouldn't stand a chance. Lillian, Coulter said quietly, still not looking at her. Go inside. Lock the door. Get the rifle and don't open up for anyone but me. You understand? I'm not leaving you. Do what I said. His voice cracked like a whip. Now. She wanted to argue, to scream, to do something other than abandon him to face 4 armed men alone. But the set of his shoulders and the absolute certainty in his voice left no room for debate. She backed toward the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the latch. That's right, little lady, Boone called out. You run inside and hide. This is men's business. Lillian slammed the door and shot the bolt home. Her breath was coming in short gasps that threatened to turn into sobs. She grabbed the rifle from above the door and checked the load with clumsy fingers, 6 rounds, fully loaded. Then she moved to the window and positioned herself where she could see what was happening outside. Coulter stood perfectly still, facing Boone. The distance between them was maybe 30 feet. The other 3 riders had formed a loose triangle, cutting off any escape. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth and coming rain. Any last words? Boone asked. Yeah. Coulter's hand hovered near his gun. You're making a mistake. The only mistake was waiting 6 years to do this. Everything happened faster than Lillian's mind could track. Boone's hand flashed toward his weapon. Coulter moved like lightning, his revolver clearing leather in one smooth motion. The first shot cracked across the valley before Boone's gun had even leveled. The big man jerked backward in his saddle, blood blooming on his shoulder. The other 3 riders drew their weapons. Coulter dove sideways, hitting the mud hard as bullets tore through the air where he'd been standing. He rolled and came up firing, his shots precise and controlled. One of the riders screamed and fell from his horse. Another's hat flew off as a bullet passed through the brim. Lillian pressed her face against the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was what Coulter had been before the ranch, this fluid violence, this terrible efficiency. He moved like a man who'd spent his entire life in gunfights. Every motion economical, every shot calculated. But it was 4 against 1, and the odds were impossible. Boone had recovered from the shoulder wound and was firing with his left hand. The remaining 2 riders had dismounted and taken cover behind their horses. Bullets slammed into the side of the barn, into the fence posts, into the mud around Coulter's feet. He fired back, methodically working through his ammunition, but he was being driven backward toward the cabin. A bullet punched through the window above Lillian's head, showering her with glass. She dropped to the floor with a strangled cry, her hands coming up to shield her face. Blood ran down her cheek from a small cut. The rifle clattered beside her. Outside, Coulter was still fighting. She could hear the sharp reports of his revolver, the answering boom of the attacker's weapons. How many shots had he fired? 5? 6? She'd lost count. If he ran out of ammunition, the thought made her move. She grabbed the rifle and crawled to the door, staying low. Her hands found the bolt and shot it back. Cold air rushed in along with the smell of gun smoke and churned mud. "Lillian, stay inside!" Coulter shouted, but she was already pushing the door open, the rifle coming up to her shoulder. She'd never fired a gun before in her life. Coulter had promised to teach her, but they'd never gotten around to it. Now she sighted down the barrel at the nearest rider, a lean man with a scar bisecting his face, and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her backward. The shot went wide, kicking up mud 5 feet to the left of her target. But it was close enough to make the man dive for cover, and in that split second of distraction, Coulter put a bullet through his leg. The man went down screaming. "Get back inside!" Coulter yelled at her. Lillian worked the rifle's action like she'd seen him do with his own weapons, chambering another round. Her shoulder throbbed where the stock had slammed into it. She aimed at Boone this time, the big man still mounted and firing from horseback. She squeezed the trigger. This shot was better. It caught Boone's horse in the flank. The animal reared with a terrified scream, throwing its rider. Boone hit the ground hard, his gun flying from his hand. For a moment he just lay there, stunned. The last uninjured rider saw his chance and charged toward Coulter, firing as he ran. Coulter's revolver clicked on an empty chamber. He dove behind the water trough as bullets hammered into the wood, sending splinters flying. His hands moved frantically, ejecting spent shells and reloading from the cartridge belt at his waist. The charging rider was closing fast, 10 feet, 8. Lillian swung the rifle toward him and fired without aiming properly. The bullet caught him high in the chest, and he stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward before he collapsed face first in the mud. The sudden silence was deafening. Lillian's ears rang, Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the rifle. Smoke drifted across the yard, turning everything hazy and unreal. Coulter rose from behind the trough, his revolver now reloaded and steady in his hand. He scanned the scene quickly. One man dead or dying, two wounded and unable to fight, Boone still on the ground trying to catch his breath. "Don't move," Coulter said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Any of you, don't even think about reaching for a weapon." Boone pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, blood running from a gash on his forehead. "This isn't over." "Yeah, it is." Coulter walked toward him slowly, his gun never wavering. "You came here looking for a killer. Well, you found one. But you also found out I'm not alone anymore. You threatened my wife, you burned my home, you bring your men onto my land. That was your mistake. You murdered my brother. Your brother got what he deserved, and you just got the same. The difference is I'm letting you live." Coulter stopped a few feet away. "You're going to get on whatever horse is still standing, take your men, and ride away. If I ever see you on my property again, I won't be so generous. You understand?" Boone's face twisted with rage and humiliation. For a moment, Lillian thought he might lunge for Coulter anyway, suicide or not. Then something in Coulter's eyes must have convinced him otherwise. The big man slowly got to his feet, swaying. "This isn't finished," he said again, but there was no strength behind it anymore. "Yes, it is, because if you come back, you're not facing just me. You're facing her too." Coulter gestured toward Lillian without looking away from Boone. "And I think you just learned she's got better aim than you expected." Boone's eyes went to Lillian standing in the doorway with the rifle still raised. Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or grudging respect. Then he spat blood into the mud and limped toward one of the horses. The wounded men helped each other mount up, leaving the dead one where he'd fallen. The man Lillian had shot in the chest wasn't moving. She'd killed him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd taken a life, squeezed a trigger and ended someone's existence. The riders disappeared over the ridge, moving slowly. Coulter stood watching until they were completely out of sight. Then finally, he turned to look at Lillian. His face was covered in mud and what might have been someone else's blood. His eyes were wild. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "I know. You could have been killed. So could you." He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. The rifle fell from her nerveless fingers. She could feel him shaking. This hard, controlled man who'd just fought 4 armed men was shaking like a leaf. "Don't ever do that again," he said roughly. "Don't ever put yourself in danger like that." "You're my husband," she said into his shirt. "Where else would I be?" He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. His arms tightened around her until she could barely breathe. They stood like that for a long time, both of them trembling, while the afternoon sun broke through the clouds and turned the bloody mud to gold. Finally, Coulter pulled back enough to look at her. He touched the cut on her cheek, his thumb gentle. "You're hurt." "It's nothing, just glass from the window." "Come inside, let me clean it properly." He led her back into the cabin, sat her down at the table, and fetched water and clean cloth. His hands were steady now as he washed the blood from her face. The cut was shallow, already clotting. He worked in silence, his jaw tight. "I killed that man," Lillian said quietly. "I know. I shot him, and he died. You saved my life." Coulter rinsed the cloth and went to work on the smaller cuts from flying glass. "He would have put a bullet in me if you hadn't dropped him first." "I feel sick." "That's normal. First time's always the worst." He paused. "I'm sorry you had to do that. Sorry this life followed me here and put you in that position." Lillian caught his hand, making him look at her. I'm not sorry. If I had to do it again, I would." Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady. "I meant what I said out there. You're my husband. This is my home. I'm not going to hide inside while men try to kill you." Something shifted in Coulter's expression. He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "When did you get so fierce?" "I learned from you." He kissed her then. Not the careful, formal kiss from their wedding, but something deep and desperate and real. Lillian kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, tasting mud and blood and fear and relief all mixed together. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "We should check on the stock," Coulter said, his voice rough. "Make sure none of the bullets hit the horses." "In a minute." She pulled him back down and kissed him again, and this time he stopped trying to be careful. His hand slid into her hair, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. The kiss turned hungry, months of restraint burning away in the wake of violence and survival. When they finally pulled apart, Coulter rested his forehead against hers. "I need to bury that man. Can't leave him in the yard." "I'll help." "No, you've done enough today." "Coulter, please, Lillian, let me do this. You go rest." He stood and moved toward the door. "I'll be back soon." She watched him walk out to where the dead rider lay in the mud. The man's face was turned toward the sky, his eyes open and empty. Coulter grabbed him by the shoulders and started dragging him toward the edge of the property where the ground was softer. Lillian sat at the table and stared at her hands. They'd stopped shaking. She'd killed a man and her hands had stopped shaking. What did that make her? The afternoon stretched into evening. Coulter came back inside after an hour, his clothes filthy with mud and grave dirt. He washed at the basin without speaking, then sat down across from her. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yeah." "Will Boone come back?" "Maybe. Probably not." He scrubbed his hands over his face. "Men like that, they need to feel like they won something even when they lose. He rode away alive. That's his victory. Coming back would just prove he can't beat me." "But you're not sure." "I'm never sure about anything. That's what living with a past like mine means. There's always someone who might remember, might want revenge, might decide today's the day to settle old scores." He looked at her directly. "I should have told you that before we got married. Should have made sure you knew what you were signing up for. Would you have let me walk away if I'd asked?" "Yes." "Then it doesn't matter. I'm here now. I'm staying." She reached across the table and took his hand. "We face it together, whatever comes." Coulter's fingers tightened around hers. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Can't I be both?" That almost smile crossed his face again. "Yeah, I guess you can." They sat there holding hands as the light faded and the cabin grew dark. Neither of them moved to light the lamps. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the promise of more rain. The ranch felt different now. Not safer exactly, but more theirs. Blood had been spilled defending it. That changed things in ways Lillian was only beginning to understand. "I'm scared," she admitted into the darkness. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp." "Are you scared?" Coulter was quiet for a long moment. "I'm terrified, not of dying. I made peace with that a long time ago, but of losing you, of this place, of everything I've built." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "I never had anything worth protecting before. Now I do. That's the scariest thing I've ever faced." Lillian stood and moved around the table. She took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "Then we protect it, together. No more secrets, no more holding back. If we're going to survive out here, we have to trust each other completely." "I do trust you." "Then prove it. Tonight. No more sleeping on opposite sides of the bed like strangers." Coulter's eyes darkened. "Lillian..." "I'm sure," she interrupted. "You asked me to be sure before anything happened between us." "Well, I am. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I chose this. I chose you. I'm choosing it again right now." He stood slowly, his hand settling on her waist. "If we do this, there's no going back. You understand that?" "I don't want to go back." He kissed her then, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful restraint, just heat and need, and the desperate urgency of two people who'd survived something terrible together. Lillian kissed him back with everything she had, her fingers working at the buttons of his shirt. They stumbled toward the bed, shedding clothes and inhibitions. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. Inside, the fire burned low and the darkness wrapped around them like a blanket. When Coulter finally laid her down on the mattress, his hands were shaking again. Not from fear this time, but from something else entirely. "You're sure what?" he asked one more time. "I'm sure." He kissed her again, and then there were no more words, just touch and breath and the feeling of two broken people trying to make something whole. It wasn't perfect or gentle or anything like the romantic stories Lillian had read as a girl. It was awkward and intense and occasionally fumbling. But it was real. It was theirs. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the darkness, Lillian felt more certain than ever that she'd made the right choice. Coulter held her close, his breath warm against her hair. No regrets? None. Even after today? After everything that happened? Especially after today. She traced the scars on his chest, learning the map of his past. We fought together. We survived together. Now we're here together. That means something. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, while the rain pounded against the roof and washed the blood from the yard. Tomorrow they'd have to deal with the aftermath. The broken window, the bullet holes in the barn, the fresh grave at the edge of the property. But tonight, they had this small pocket of warmth and safety, and something that was starting to feel like love. When Lillian woke in the morning, sunlight was streaming through the damaged window. Coulter was already up, standing by the door with a cup of coffee, staring out at the ranch. She watched him for a moment, this hard man with his scarred face and haunted eyes, who'd somehow become the most important person in her world. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned, and when he saw her awake, his expression softened. "That we need to fix that window before the next storm, and that I need to ride into town and file a report about what happened yesterday. Will there be trouble? Maybe. Depends on who Boone knows. But I can't just let it go unreported. That's not how you build a respectable life." Lillian got up and moved to stand beside him, wrapping the blanket around herself. "We'll handle it. Whatever comes. We will." He handed her his coffee, and she took a sip. Still hot, strong enough to peel paint. "I'm riding out in an hour. You want to come with me? To town?" "Yeah. Time people met my wife properly, time they saw you're not going anywhere." Lillian thought about the women who'd refused him, the whispers, the judgment that surely still followed his name. Then she thought about standing in the doorway with a rifle, about choosing to fight instead of hide, about the way his hands had felt on her skin last night. "Yes," she said. "I'll come with you." He smiled. A real smile this time, not just the shadow of one. "Good. We'll face them together. Together." The word felt like a promise, like an anchor, like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for until now. The ride into Fort Shepherd took 2 hours through mud that sucked at the horse's hooves with every step. Lillian sat beside Coulter on the wagon seat, her back straight despite the exhaustion still pulling at her bones. She dressed in her best dress, the blue one that had survived the train journey mostly intact, and pinned her hair up properly for the first time since arriving at the ranch. If she was going to face the town that had rejected her husband, she wanted to look like she belonged at his side. Coulter hadn't said much since they left. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly. The rifle lay across his lap, within easy reach. He was expecting trouble. Maybe not today, but eventually. "What will you tell the sheriff?" Lillian asked as they crested the ridge and the town came into view below. "The truth. That Boone Mercer and 3 of his men rode onto my property with intent to kill. That we defended ourselves. That one of his men died in the exchange." Coulter's hands tightened on the reins. "The sheriff's a fair man. He knows my history. He also knows I've been keeping my head down for 3 years. That should count for something. And if it doesn't, then we deal with whatever comes." The town was busier than Lillian remembered from her arrival. People moved along the muddy boardwalks, going in and out of shops. A group of men stood outside the saloon, smoking and talking. They all stopped and stared as the wagon rolled past. Lillian felt their eyes on her like physical weight. Coulter pulled the wagon up in front of a small building with a faded sign that read Sheriff. He set the brake and climbed down, then came around to help Lillian. His hand on her waist was steady, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. "Stay close," he said quietly. The sheriff's office smelled like old coffee and tobacco. A man sat behind a battered desk, looking up as they entered. He was in his 50s, with iron gray hair and a face that had seen every kind of trouble the frontier could offer. When he saw Coulter, something flickered in his expression. Not quite surprise, but close. "Hayes," he said, "didn't expect to see you in town." "Sheriff Garrett?" Coulter took off his hat. "This is my wife, Lillian." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly. So the rumors were true. You really did go and get yourself married. He nodded to Lillian. Ma'am? Sheriff, she said, keeping her voice steady. We're here to report an incident, Coulter continued. Yesterday afternoon, 4 armed men rode onto my property, led by a man named Boone Mercer. They came looking for blood. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his expression going carefully neutral. And we defended ourselves. One of Mercer's men is dead. The other 3 rode off wounded. You kill him? Coulter hesitated for just a fraction of a second. My wife did. He was about to shoot me in the back. Garrett's eyes swung to Lillian with new interest. That true, ma'am? Lillian's throat was dry, but she made herself meet his gaze. Yes, sir. I shot him with my husband's rifle. He was charging at Coulter with his gun drawn. I didn't have a choice. First time you ever fired a weapon? Yes, sir. Hell of a first shot. Garrett stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street. Boone Mercer. I know that name. His brother was the gun dealer you took down outside Santa Fe. What? 6, 7 years back? 6 years, Coulter confirmed. I was hired to stop him. I did the job. Boone swore revenge, but I haven't seen him since, until yesterday. Where's the body now? Buried on my property. Didn't seem right to leave him rotting in the yard. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he turned back, his face was grim. You know, this puts me in a difficult position. Boone Mercer's got connections, money, people who'll want answers about what happened to his men. The answer is self-defense. 4 armed men against 2 people protecting their home. That's legal in every territory I know of. Legal? Yes. But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. Garrett moved back to his desk and pulled out a ledger. I need to take down the full account, every detail. Then I need to ride out to your place and see the scene for myself. If everything matches up, we can probably put this to rest. If it doesn't, it will, Coulter interrupted. I'm not lying to you, Garrett. I never have. No, but your definition of self-defense and mine might be different. You've got a history of shooting first and sorting details later. That was a different life. Was it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like that life just came knocking at your door. Garrett opened the ledger and picked up a pencil. Now sit down and tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning. They spent the next hour going over every detail. Garrett asked questions, hard questions that made Lillian's stomach churn. How many shots were fired? Who drew first? Where was each body positioned? Could Mercer's men reasonably have been perceived as a threat, or were they just talking? Coulter answered everything calmly, his voice never wavering. When Garrett turned to Lillian, she did her best to stay composed, even though her hands were shaking in her lap. You say this man was charging at your husband, Garrett said. How far away was he when you fired? Maybe 10 feet? Close enough I could see his face. And your husband's gun? Was empty. He was reloading behind the water trough. So if you hadn't shot this man, he would have killed your husband. Yes. Lillian's voice came out stronger than she felt. That's exactly what would have happened. Garrett made a note in the ledger, then looked up at Coulter. You teach her to shoot? Hadn't gotten around to it yet. Lucky for you, she's a natural. Garrett closed the book with a snap. All right, I'll ride out tomorrow to examine the scene and the grave. If everything checks out the way you're saying, I'll file this as justified homicide in defense of property. But Hayes, and I'm saying this as someone who doesn't entirely dislike you, you need to be prepared for Boone to file complaints. Maybe even try to get a warrant issued. On what grounds? On the grounds that his men are saying something different than you are. On the grounds that a man with your history is always going to be suspect. On the grounds that rich men with grudges can afford good lawyers. Garrett stood. Keep your head down. Don't give anyone ammunition to come after you. And for heaven's sake, teach your wife to shoot properly before the next time someone decides to test you. They left the sheriff's office with a weight settling over both of them. The street was fuller now, and the stairs were more obvious. Lillian could hear whispers starting up in their wake. She kept her chin high and her hand tucked into the crook of Coulter's arm. We need supplies, Coulter said quietly. May as well get them while we're here. The general store was at the end of the main street. A bell jangled as they entered, and the woman behind the counter looked up. She was middle-aged, plump, with sharp eyes that took in everything at once. When she saw Coulter, her expression went carefully blank. Mr. Hayes, she said, what can I do for you? Need ammunition, coffee, sugar, fabric for curtains if you have any. Coulter's voice was neutral, polite. And my wife could use some proper work clothes. What she's got isn't holding up to ranch life. The woman's eyes moved to Lillian, assessing. Work clothes for a lady. I might have something that'll fit. She came out from behind the counter, circling Lillian like she was livestock at auction. You're smaller than most women out here. Might need alterations. I can manage alterations, Lillian said quietly. Can you now? The woman's tone was skeptical. You one of those city girls who thinks sewing is just for pretty dresses? I spent 3 years working in a garment factory in Boston. I can sew anything you put in front of me. That got a flicker of respect. The woman nodded slowly. Factory work. That's honest labor. She moved toward the back of the store. Come on, let's see what we can find. Coulter stayed by the counter while the woman, she introduced herself as Mrs. Fletcher, led Lillian to a section of ready-made clothing. Most of it was practical to the point of being ugly, but Lillian didn't care. She picked out 2 sturdy skirts, 3 work shirts, and a heavy coat that would actually keep out the wind. You really marry him? Mrs. Fletcher asked suddenly, her voice low. Or is this some kind of arrangement? Lillian met her eyes directly. I married him, legal and binding. You know what he was? I know what he did. I also know what he's trying to be now. That's what matters to me. Mrs. Fletcher studied her for a long moment. Most women wouldn't have the stomach for a man like that. They'd be too scared or too disgusted. I'm both of those things sometimes, but I'm also his wife. And yesterday, when 4 armed men came to our ranch looking to kill him, I didn't run and hide. I picked up a rifle and fought beside him. Lillian's voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. So you can judge me if you want. You can whisper about me like I know everyone in this town is doing, but I'm not going anywhere. Something shifted in Mrs. Fletcher's expression. Not quite approval, but something close. You got more spine than I gave you credit for. She pulled down another shirt from the shelf. Take this one too. No charge. Every woman out here needs a spare when the work gets rough. They carried the clothes back to the counter where Coulter was waiting. He'd already gathered the other supplies, coffee, sugar, ammunition boxes, a length of fabric for the curtains. While Mrs. Fletcher tallied everything up, 3 women entered the store. They stopped short when they saw Coulter, their conversation dying mid-sentence. One of them was young and pretty, with blonde curls and a dress that looked expensive. She stared at Coulter with something like longing mixed with fear. Another was older, severe, with a face that suggested she'd never smiled in her life. The third was somewhere in between, nervous and fidgety. Ladies, Mrs. Fletcher said without much warmth, help you with something? We heard, the blonde started, then stopped. Her eyes went to Lillian. Is it true? About what happened at the Hayes Ranch? That depends on what you heard, Coulter said flatly. That Boone Mercer rode out there with his men. That there was shooting. The blonde twisted her hands together. That someone died. It's true, Coulter confirmed. They came onto my property looking for trouble. They found it. The severe woman made a disapproving sound. Always violence with you, isn't it? Can't even live peacefully without drawing blood. They drew first, Lillian said sharply, surprising herself. 4 armed men against my husband. They would have killed him if we hadn't fought back. All 3 women turned to stare at her. The blonde's eyes widened. You fought? I shot one of them. He died. The sheriff has the full report. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. The severe woman's mouth pressed into a thin line. The nervous one looked like she might faint. But the blonde stepped closer, her expression shifting into something almost like admiration. You actually fought? She repeated. You picked up a gun and defended your husband? What else was I supposed to do? Let them kill him? Most women would have hidden, would have let the men handle it. Most women aren't married to Coulter Hayes. Lillian felt her face heat but held her ground. And I'm not most women. The blonde smiled, small and brief, but genuine. No, I don't suppose you are. She turned to the others. Come on, we should let them finish their business. They left in a flutter of skirts and whispers. Mrs. Fletcher finished the tally and accepted Coulter's payment without comment. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, Lillian could feel eyes watching from every storefront, every window. The whole town was buzzing with the story by now. She could practically hear the gossip spreading like wildfire. "That went better than I expected," Coulter said as he climbed onto the wagon seat. "Did it? You're still standing. Nobody threw anything. Mrs. Fletcher gave you a free shirt. That's practically a warm welcome by Fort Shepherd standards." Lillian managed a weak smile. "The bar is lower than I thought." They were about to leave when a man stepped into their path. He was tall and well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from money and power. His eyes were cold as he looked up at Coulter. "Hayes," he said, "heard you had some trouble yesterday." "Nothing I couldn't handle, Mr. Cassidy." So this was Cassidy. Lillian had heard the name in passing. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, ran cattle operations that dwarfed anything Coulter was doing. He had influence with the territorial government, connections that reached all the way to Washington. "Boone Mercer is a business associate of mine," Cassidy continued. "He says you murdered one of his men in cold blood." "He's a liar. They came onto my property armed and threatening. We defended ourselves. Sheriff Garrett has the full account." "Garrett's a local lawman. I'm talking about territorial authority, federal marshals." Cassidy's smile was thin and sharp. "I'm talking about making sure justice is properly served." "There's nothing to investigate. It was self-defense. That's for the courts to decide, not you." Cassidy stepped closer to the wagon. "You've been a problem since the day you settled here, Hayes. Decent people don't want your kind in this territory. The past doesn't stay buried just because you buy some land and play rancher." Coulter's hand moved slowly toward his hip, then stopped. Lillian could see him fighting for control. "I've broken no laws. I've caused no trouble. I run my ranch, mind my business, and stay out of everyone's way. Until gunfights break out in your yard and bodies pile up. That's not the kind of neighbor we want around here." "Then it's lucky I don't much care what you want." Coulter's voice went cold and flat. "Now get out of my way before this conversation goes somewhere neither of us wants it to go." Cassidy held his ground for another moment, then stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Coulter snapped the reins and the horses lurched forward. They rode through town in tense silence, past staring faces and whispered conversations. Lillian didn't breathe properly until they were clear of the last buildings and heading back toward the open plains. "Who was that man?" she asked finally. "Trouble. The worst kind. Rich and powerful and convinced he owns everyone around him." Coulter's jaw was tight. He and Boone Mercer do business together, probably shipping cattle through Mercer's freight lines. If Boone's making complaints, Cassidy will back him up. Can he really bring in federal marshals? If he pushes hard enough, yes. Territorial governors listen to men with money, and federal marshals don't care much about local context. They just see a man with my history and assume the worst. Lillian's chest felt tight. "So what do we do?" "We go home. We fix that window. We keep working the ranch. And we hope like hell that Sheriff Garrett files his report before Cassidy can make his move." Coulter glanced at her. "I'm sorry. This isn't the life I promised you. You never promised me anything except honesty. You've kept that promise." "Have I? Because it feels like I keep dragging you into situations where you have to fight for your life." "I made my choice. I keep making it." She moved closer on the wagon seat until their shoulders touched. "Whatever happens next, we face it together. That's what being married means." He didn't answer, but his hand found hers and held tight. The ranch looked quiet when they arrived back. Too quiet. Coulter pulled the wagon up slowly, his eyes scanning the property. The horses in the corral shifted nervously. A crow took flight from the barn roof with a harsh cry. "Something's wrong," Coulter said quietly. "What?" "I don't know yet. Stay in the wagon." He climbed down and pulled the rifle from its slot. Lillian watched him approach the cabin carefully, checking the corners, the windows. When he pushed open the door, she heard him swear, sharp and vicious. She climbed down and ran to the cabin despite his earlier instruction. When she reached the doorway, she stopped dead. The inside had been ransacked. The table was overturned. Their supplies were scattered across the floor. The mattress had been slashed open, spilling feathers everywhere. On the wall above the fireplace, someone had painted a message in something dark red that might have been blood or might have been paint. Leave or die. They came back, Lillian whispered. No, different people. Boone's men would have burned the place down. Coulter moved through the cabin, checking for other damage. This was meant to scare us, to make us understand we're not welcome. Cassidy? Or someone he paid, doesn't matter. The message is clear. He picked up the overturned chair and righted it. They want us gone. Lillian stared at the words on the wall. 4 simple words that carried so much threat. She thought about Boston, about running from debt collectors, about the desperation that had brought her west in the first place. Then she thought about the rifle in her hands yesterday, about choosing to fight, about the way Coulter looked at her like she was worth protecting. No, she said firmly. Coulter turned to look at her. No what? No, we're not leaving. No, they don't get to scare us away. No, we're not giving up everything we've built just because some rich man thinks he can push us around. She moved to the wall and touched the painted message. This is our home. We fought for it. We bled for it. I killed a man to defend it. I'm not walking away now. Lillian, I mean it, Coulter. You want to leave? Fine, but I'm staying. With or without you, I'm staying. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or pride, or something else entirely. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. You're crazy, he said roughly. You know that? I learned from the best. He laughed, actual laughter, rough and startled. When he pulled back to look at her, his eyes were bright. All right, we stay. We fight. We make them regret ever thinking they could break us. Damn right we do. They spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up the mess. Lillian swept up broken glass and scattered flour while Coulter worked on patching the slashed mattress. The painted message stayed on the wall for now. They'd deal with it later. As the sun set, they stood together in the doorway and looked out at the land they'd chosen to defend. It won't be easy, Coulter said quietly. Cassidy's got resources we don't have. He can make life difficult in ways we haven't even thought of yet. Then we'll figure it out as it comes. You really meant what you said? About staying even if I left? Lillian turned to face him. I came west because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because I chose you. Because this place started feeling like home. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving, I'm building something. She took his scarred hands in hers. So yes, I meant it. You're stuck with me now. Coulter's thumb stroked across her knuckles. I sent for a mail-order bride because I thought I needed help running a ranch. Turns out what I really needed was a partner. Someone who wouldn't run when things got hard. Someone who'd stand beside me even when the smart choice was to leave. Is that what I am? Your partner? If you'll have me. I already did. I married you, didn't I? You did, though I'm starting to think you got the worse end of that deal. Lillian smiled. Maybe, but I'm not one for backing out of deals once they're made. They went inside as full darkness fell. Coulter built up the fire while Lillian made dinner from what supplies hadn't been destroyed in the ransacking. They ate sitting on the floor since the table was too damaged to use properly. It should have felt like defeat. Their home violated, their safety threatened, their future uncertain. Instead, it felt like resolve solidifying into something unbreakable. After dinner, they worked together to clear enough space for sleeping. The slashed mattress would need serious repairs, but for tonight, they made do with blankets on the floor near the fire. Lillian lay with her head on Coulter's chest, listening to his heartbeat, thinking about everything that had happened in the span of a single day. Coulter? She said into the darkness. Yeah? When you sent that advertisement for a mail-order bride, did you ever imagine it would turn out like this? He was quiet for a moment. No. I thought I'd get someone practical. Someone who needed a roof over her head and didn't ask too many questions. Someone who'd help with the work and stay out of my way. That's not what you got. No, I got someone who asks hard questions and demands honest answers. Someone who fights beside me instead of hiding. Someone who makes me want to be better than I am. His arms tightened around her. I got lucky, even if it doesn't always feel like it. I got lucky too, Lillian admitted. I came here expecting a monster. Instead, I found... She paused, searching for the right word. A damaged man trying to do better? A partner, she corrected. Someone worth fighting for. They lay in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn low and listening to the wind outside. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound was lonely and wild and somehow right for this place. Tomorrow they'd have to deal with Sheriff Garrett's inspection, with Cassidy's threats, with the painted message and the violated home and the constant awareness that danger was always just over the horizon. But tonight they had this: warmth and safety and each other. It would have to be enough, because neither of them was backing down. Not now, not ever. Sheriff Garrett arrived at dawn with 2 deputies and a face that said he'd rather be anywhere else. Lillian watched from the cabin doorway as the 3 men dismounted and surveyed the ransacked property. The painted threat on the wall was visible even from outside, stark and ugly in the morning light. "Hell of a mess," Garrett muttered, stepping through the door. His eyes went to the message, then to the scattered belongings, then back to Coulter. "When'd this happen?" "Yesterday, while we were in town talking to you." Coulter's voice was flat. "Someone knew we'd be gone." "Cassidy's work?" "Can't prove it, but the timing's convenient." Garrett walked the perimeter of the cabin, his deputies following. One of them, a young man with nervous hands, kept glancing at Lillian like she might suddenly pull a weapon. She supposed she couldn't blame him. The story of her shooting Mercer's man had probably spread through town by now, growing with each retelling. "Show me where the shooting happened," Garrett said. They walked outside to where the mud still held evidence of the fight. Bullet holes scarred the barn wall. Deep gouges marked the fence posts. The water trough had 3 clean holes punched through it, slowly leaking. Coulter walked Garrett through the positions, where each man had stood, who'd fired first, how it had unfolded. "And the grave?" Garrett asked. Coulter led them to the edge of the property where he'd buried Mercer's man. The earth was still fresh, a dark rectangle against the brown grass. Garrett stood over it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You got a name for him?" "Never asked. Didn't seem important at the time." "It's important now. I need to file proper paperwork." Garrett pulled out a small notebook. "Describe him." Coulter did. Height, build, scars. The scar that bisected his face. One of the deputies wrote it all down in careful script. When they were finished, Garrett turned back toward the cabin. "All right, based on what I'm seeing here, this looks like self-defense. 4 armed men, clear threats made. Your wife's testimony matches the physical evidence." He tucked the notebook away. "I'll file it as justified homicide, but Hayes, you need to understand something. This won't be the end of it." "I know. Cassidy's already been to my office, twice. He's pushing for territorial involvement, says you're a danger to the community." Garrett's eyes were hard. "He's got pull I don't have. If he gets a federal marshal out here, my report won't mean much." "So what do I do?" "You keep your head down. You don't give him any more ammunition, and you pray that Boone Mercer decides revenge isn't worth the trouble." Garrett moved toward his horse. "I'll do what I can, but I'm just a county sheriff. My authority only goes so far." After the lawmen left, Lillian and Coulter stood in the yard watching dust settle on the road. The morning sun was warm on her face, but she felt cold all the way through. "We can't just wait for them to come at us again," she said. "What else can we do? Fight Cassidy? He owns half the territory. Fighting him would be like—" Coulter stopped, searching for words. "Like what?" "Like trying to hold back a flood with your bare hands. It's not a fight you can win." Lillian turned to look at him directly. "You fought in a war. You survived being a gunfighter when most men in that profession died young. You built this ranch from nothing. Don't tell me you can't fight one rich man. It's not the same. This isn't about being fast or tough or willing to bleed. Cassidy fights with lawyers and political connections and money. I don't have weapons against that." "Then we find some." She moved closer, taking his hands. "We've survived everything else. The winter, the isolation, Boone Mercer showing up with his men. We didn't quit then. We're not quitting now." Something shifted in Coulter's expression. "You really believe we can win this?" "I believe we can fight. That's all anyone can do." He kissed her then, quick and fierce, before pulling back with something like determination settling over his features. "All right, we fight, but we do it smart. No more reacting. We make a plan." They spent the morning repairing what they could. Coulter fixed the water trough while Lillian worked on scrubbing the painted message off the wall. The words were stubborn, bleeding through each coat of whitewash she applied. By the fourth attempt, they'd faded enough to be illegible, but she could still see the ghost of them if she looked hard enough. Around noon, Monroe showed up on his mule looking hungover and guilty. He dismounted carefully, like his head hurt, and approached the cabin with his hat in his hands. "Hayes," he said. "Mrs. Hayes, I heard what happened. The shooting, then the ransacking. I wanted to—" He stopped, struggling. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for coming here drunk and scaring your wife with talk about Boone Mercer. Turns out I wasn't wrong, but that don't make it right." Coulter studied him for a moment. "You sober now?" 3 days, planning to stay that way. "Good. Then maybe you can help us with something." Monroe's eyebrows rose. "Help how?" "Information. You know the ranchers around here. You know who's allied with Cassidy and who isn't. We need to understand what we're up against." Monroe nodded slowly. "Cassidy's got about a dozen ranchers in his pocket. Men who ship their cattle through his operation use his contacts to get better prices. They won't move against him." He paused. "But there's others, smaller operations like yours and mine, folks who resent Cassidy controlling everything. They might listen if you approach them right." "Why would they help me? I'm not exactly popular." "Because you stood up to Boone Mercer and lived. Because your wife grabbed a rifle and defended her home instead of running." Monroe glanced at Lillian with something like respect. "Word's spreading about that. Some folks are saying maybe you're not the monster everyone thought. Maybe you're just a man trying to live quiet." "And the rest?" "The rest think you're dangerous and should be run out of the territory. But that's why you need allies. People willing to speak up when Cassidy starts pushing." Coulter was quiet for a moment, thinking. Who should I talk to first? Monroe listed names, ranchers, shopkeepers, even a few townspeople who'd expressed doubts about Cassidy's growing power. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When he finished, he climbed back on his mule and tipped his hat to Lillian. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I think Hayes got lucky when he found you. Not many women would have stayed after everything you've been through." "I'm not planning to go anywhere," Lillian said. "I can see that." Monroe smiled, brief but genuine. "Good luck to you both. You're going to need it." Over the next 2 weeks, Coulter made the rounds. He visited small ranchers, offering help with fence repairs and cattle drives in exchange for nothing but conversation. Lillian went with him sometimes, sitting quietly while the men talked, observing how her husband had changed from the silent, guarded man she'd first met. He was still careful with his words, but there was an openness now that hadn't existed before. He talked about building something lasting, about proving that a man's past didn't have to define his future. Slowly, cautiously, people started to listen. Not everyone. Some doors remained closed, some ranchers refused to even speak with him, but enough extended hands that Lillian began to feel like maybe they weren't fighting alone anymore. Then Cassidy made his move. It started with the bank. Coulter had taken out a loan to buy breeding stock the previous year, a small loan, manageable, with payments he'd never missed. One morning, a letter arrived from the bank manager requesting immediate payment in full. The letter cited concerns about property stability and risk factors associated with the borrower's history. Coulter read it twice, his face going pale. "He's calling the loan. If I can't pay the full amount by the end of the month, the bank seizes the ranch." Lillian's stomach dropped. "How much do you owe?" $1,200. It might as well have been $12,000. They didn't have that kind of money. Even selling every head of cattle wouldn't cover it. "There has to be something we can do," Lillian said. "Someone we can talk to. The bank manager is Cassidy's brother-in-law. You think he'll listen?" "Maybe not, but we have to try." They rode into town the next day, both of them knowing it was probably futile, but needing to try anyway. The bank was a solid brick building that looked more permanent than anything else in Fort Shepherd. The manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a superior expression, barely looked up when they entered. "Mr. Hayes, I assume you're here about the loan." "I'm here to ask for an extension. I've never missed a payment. I'm good for the money." "The bank's position has changed regarding your account. We need immediate payment or we'll be forced to take action." "Why? What's changed?" The manager finally looked up, his eyes cold behind his glasses. "Your association with violent incidents. The shooting on your property. The concerns expressed by prominent citizens about your influence on the community. The bank cannot continue to support borrowers who pose a liability. That's horseshit and you know it, Coulter said flatly. Cassidy's behind this. He wants my land. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You're his brother-in-law. He tells you what to do and you do it. The manager's face flushed. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If payment isn't received by month's end, we'll begin foreclosure proceedings. Lillian watched Coulter's hands clench into fists. For a moment she thought he might hit the man. Then he turned and walked out without another word. She followed, her mind racing through impossible calculations. Outside, Coulter stood in the street, breathing hard. He's going to take it. Everything we built. He's going to take it, and there's nothing I can do to stop him. There has to be a way. There isn't. Not one that doesn't end with me dead or in prison. He looked at her, and the defeat in his eyes was worse than any threat they'd faced. I'm sorry, Lillian. I brought you out here and promised you a home, and now I'm going to lose it. We're going to lose it, she corrected. Not just you. We. And we're not beaten yet. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. That evening they sat at the repaired table going through their finances. No matter how they calculated, they couldn't find enough. Selling the cattle would get them halfway there. Selling the horses might add another 200, but they'd still be short, and without livestock they'd have no way to make the ranch profitable again anyway. I could ask Monroe for a loan, Coulter said without much hope. Maybe some of the other ranchers. Would they have that kind of money? Probably not, and even if they did, asking for it would make me look weak, desperate. You are desperate, we both are. He couldn't argue with that. Lillian stared at the numbers until they blurred. There had to be something they weren't seeing, some option they'd overlooked. Her mind kept circling back to Boston, to the factory work that had slowly destroyed her mother's health, to the ruthless efficiency of survival when you had nothing left to lose. What if we go to the newspapers? She said suddenly. Coulter looked up. What? The territorial newspapers. We tell them what Cassidy's doing, how he's using his influence to destroy a small rancher who defended his property legally, how he's manipulating the banks to seize land. She was talking faster now, the idea taking shape. People don't like bullies, especially rich ones who think they can do whatever they want. Cassidy will sue for slander. Only if it's not true. Is it true? Every word. But proving it is different than knowing it. We don't need to prove it in court. We just need public opinion on our side. Make it expensive for him to keep coming after us. Lillian leaned forward. He's counting on us being too scared or too isolated to fight back. What if we're not? Coulter was quiet for a long time, thinking. Then slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. It's a risk, a big one. But at this point, what do we have to lose? They spent the next 3 days writing letters to every newspaper in the territory. Lillian handled most of the writing. Her factory work had taught her to be precise and compelling when she needed to be. She told their story simply. A reformed gunfighter trying to build an honest life, a mail-order bride who'd found her courage in defending their home, and a powerful rancher determined to crush them for refusing to submit. The first response came from a newspaper in Cheyenne. The editor was interested. He wanted to interview them both, maybe send a reporter to see the ranch. 2 days later, a paper in Laramie expressed similar interest, then one in Denver. Word was spreading. Cassidy must have heard about it because he showed up at the ranch one morning with 6 men. They weren't armed, at least not openly, but the threat was clear. He sat on his horse looking down at where Coulter stood in the yard, his expression carved from stone. You're making a mistake, Cassidy said. Going to the papers, spreading lies about me. I haven't lied about anything. You're trying to destroy my reputation. I'm trying to save my ranch. If that hurts your reputation, maybe you should reconsider your actions. Cassidy's jaw tightened. I came here to make you an offer. A good one. I'll buy your property for fair market value. You and your wife can walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. Somewhere people don't know your history. This is my home. I'm not selling. Even if it means losing everything, even then. You're a fool, Hayes. You can't win this fight. Coulter stepped closer to Cassidy's horse, his eyes hard. Maybe not, but I can make it expensive for you. I can make sure everyone in the territory knows what kind of man you really are. How you bully anyone who won't bend to your will. How you use your money and connections to destroy decent people. His voice dropped lower. You want my land that badly? You're going to have to take it in front of witnesses, in front of newspapers, in front of everyone who's starting to wonder if maybe you've had too much power for too long." For the first time, Lillian saw uncertainty flicker across Cassidy's face. He looked at Coulter, then at the ranch, then at the 6 men he'd brought with him. Whatever he saw made him hesitate. "This isn't over," he said finally. "I'm counting on it." Cassidy turned his horse and rode away, his men following. Lillian came out of the cabin where she'd been watching through the window, her heart hammering. "You really think that worked?" she asked. "I think we just bought ourselves time. Maybe enough to find another option." The option arrived 3 days later in the form of a sharp-dressed man from Cheyenne who introduced himself as a lawyer. His name was Thompson, and he represented a group of territorial businessmen who'd grown tired of Cassidy's monopolistic practices. "We've been looking for someone willing to stand against him publicly," Thompson explained, sitting at their table. "Someone with a compelling story. You two fit that perfectly." "What do you want from us?" Coulter asked, suspicious. "Your testimony, documented evidence of Cassidy's intimidation tactics. In exchange, we'll cover your loan payment and provide legal protection against any retaliation." "Why? What's in it for you?" "Breaking Cassidy's stranglehold on territorial commerce. He controls shipping routes, manipulates prices, drives out competition. We represent merchants and ranchers who want a fair market." Thompson pulled papers from his bag. "This isn't charity. It's business. Your fight with Cassidy gives us the opening we need to challenge his practices legally." Lillian and Coulter exchanged a look. It felt too good to be true, which usually meant it was. But they were running out of time and options. "What exactly would we have to do?" Lillian asked. "Testify before the Territorial Commerce Committee. Provide documentation of the loan manipulation, the threats, the ransacking of your property. Let us use your story as evidence of a pattern of behavior." Thompson folded his hands. "We'll handle the legal work. All you have to do is tell the truth. And if Cassidy retaliates, we'll have legal recourse. And more importantly, you'll have public attention. He can't easily destroy you when everyone's watching." They talked for another hour, going over details. Thompson left the papers for them to review and promised to return in 2 days for an answer. After he left, Lillian and Coulter sat in heavy silence. "It could be a trap," Coulter said finally. "It could also be our only chance. If we do this, there's no going back. Cassidy will come at us with everything he has. He's already doing that." Lillian picked up the papers Thompson had left. "At least this way, we're not fighting alone." Coulter rubbed his face with both hands. "You sure about this? Really sure?" "No, but I'm sure I'm not giving up our home without a fight." When Thompson returned, they signed the papers. The territorial commerce hearing took place in Cheyenne 6 weeks later. Lillian had never been so nervous in her life. The hearing room was packed with lawyers, merchants, ranchers, and journalists. Cassidy sat at one table with 3 lawyers of his own, his expression radiating controlled fury. Lillian testified first. She told the story simply, answering the advertisement, arriving at the ranch, the attack by Mercer's men, the ransacking, the loan manipulation. Thompson asked careful questions that let her tell it in her own words. Cassidy's lawyers tried to rattle her on cross-examination, implying she was lying or exaggerating, but she held steady. Then Coulter took the stand. He was calm under questioning, methodical in laying out the timeline of events. When Cassidy's lawyers brought up his past, the men he'd killed, the violence he'd engaged in, Coulter didn't flinch. "I'm not proud of what I was," he said clearly, "but I'm trying to be something different now. Mr. Cassidy can't accept that a man might change. He'd rather destroy me than admit he might be wrong about who I am." The hearing lasted 3 days. Other ranchers testified about similar intimidation. Merchants talked about being forced out of business. By the end, even the committee members who'd been sympathetic to Cassidy looked troubled. The ruling came 2 weeks later. The committee found evidence of monopolistic practices and recommended territorial oversight of Cassidy's business operations. More importantly, they ruled that the loan manipulation constituted predatory lending and ordered the bank to restore Coulter's original payment terms. They'd won. Not completely. Cassidy wasn't ruined, just reined in. But the ranch was safe. The loan was manageable again. And most importantly, Cassidy's untouchable reputation had been permanently damaged. The ride back to the ranch felt different than any journey Lillian had made before. She sat close to Coulter on the wagon seat, watching the familiar landscape roll past, feeling something settle in her chest that she slowly recognized as peace. "You think he'll try again?" she asked. "Probably not. Too much attention on him now, too much risk." Coulter glanced at her. "Doesn't mean we're safe forever, but for now, we won." "We did, didn't we?" "Yeah, we did." The ranch looked exactly the same when they arrived, but somehow different. The cabin they'd defended, the land they'd refused to give up, the home they'd fought for together. Lillian climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard, letting it all sink in. "What are you thinking?" Coulter asked, coming to stand beside her. "That I came here desperate and scared, expecting the worst, and somehow I found something worth fighting for." She turned to look at him. "Found someone worth fighting for?" He pulled her close, his arms warm and solid around her. "I sent for a bride because I was lonely, because I thought having someone here would make this place feel less empty." His voice was rough. "Turns out what I really needed was a partner, someone stubborn enough to stand with me when everything went to hell." "You got lucky." "I really did." They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, cattle moved slowly across the pasture. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney where they'd left the fire banked. Everything was exactly as it should be. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were good. They expanded the herd slowly, built a second barn, hired seasonal workers during roundup. The ranch grew into something respectable, known throughout the territory for quality stock and honest dealing. Coulter's reputation shifted from feared gunfighter to respected rancher, though the old whispers never completely died. Lillian learned to ride well enough to work cattle. She became known in her own right, not just as Coulter Hayes' wife, but as the woman who defended her home with a rifle in her hands and fire in her eyes. Women in Fort Shepherd started treating her differently. Not all of them, but enough. She'd proven herself in a way they understood. 3 years after the hearing, their first child was born, a daughter with Coulter's blue eyes and Lillian's stubborn chin. They named her Sarah after Coulter's mother. She was followed 2 years later by a son, then another daughter. The cabin they'd defended grew into a proper house with rooms for each child and windows that let in morning light. On quiet evenings, Coulter would sometimes pull out the tintype of himself and his brother James, showing it to the children and telling them about the man who died at Shiloh. He talked about the war honestly, not glorifying it, but not hiding from it either. He wanted them to understand that people could survive terrible things and still build good lives. Lillian kept the contract she'd signed, the advertisement that had brought her west, in a small box in their bedroom. Sometimes she'd take it out and read it, marveling at how desperate and hopeful she'd been, how little she'd known about what she was walking into. She'd traded her name for the promise of food and shelter. What she'd gotten was so much more. 10 years after the hearing on the anniversary of her arrival in Wyoming, Lillian stood on the porch of their house watching the sun rise over land they'd fought to keep. Coulter came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About that day on the train platform. How scared I was. How you looked at me and I was sure I'd made a terrible mistake. And now? Now I know it was the best decision I ever made." She turned in his arms to face him. "I came here expecting to survive. Instead, I learned to live." Coulter smiled. The real smile he saved for her and the children, the one that erased years from his face. "I was dead before you came. Didn't even know it. You brought me back. We brought each other back." They stood together as the valley came alive around them, birds calling, cattle moving, their children's voices drifting from inside the house. The ranch had become exactly what they dreamed it could be. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and solid and theirs. Sometimes Lillian thought about the painted message on the wall, "Leave or die." They'd scrubbed it away and painted over it, but she could still see the ghost of it if she looked hard enough. A reminder of what they'd survived, of what they'd refused to give up. People asked her sometimes, usually women from town, why she'd stayed, why she hadn't run when the shooting started, when Cassidy came after them, when everything seemed hopeless. They couldn't understand how a Boston girl with no frontier experience had found the strength to defend a home that wasn't even hers yet. The answer was simple, though she didn't always share it. She'd stayed because for the first time in her life, she'd had something worth defending. Not just the land or the cabin or the cattle, but the partnership she'd built with a damaged man who'd given her honesty when he could have given her lies, who treated her with respect when he could have treated her like property, who'd made her feel like she mattered. Love, she'd learned, wasn't the soft thing the romantic stories promised. It was choosing to stand beside someone when standing was hard. It was fighting together instead of running separately. It was building something real out of desperation and hope, and sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. She'd come west as a mail-order bride with 62 cents and no prospects. She'd become a rancher's wife, a mother, a woman who'd killed to protect what mattered. The transformation hadn't been smooth or easy or anything like what she'd imagined. It had been messy and terrifying and occasionally violent, but it had also been worth every moment. Coulter kissed her temple, pulling her from her thoughts. "Come on, kids will be hungry soon." They went inside together, leaving the sunrise behind. The house smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the bread Lillian had baked the night before. Sarah was already up, helping her younger siblings get dressed. The boy, they'd named him James, after the uncle he'd never meet, was complaining about having to feed the chickens. Normal morning chaos, normal family life, the kind of normal that Lillian had once thought was impossible for people like them. Years later, when the children were grown and starting families of their own, people would still tell stories about Coulter Hayes and his mail-order bride, about the gunfighter who became a respected rancher, about the Boston girl who stood her ground with a rifle when armed men came calling, about how they'd fought a powerful man and won, not through violence, but through stubborn determination and the willingness to bet everything on each other. The stories grew in the telling, as stories do. Some parts got exaggerated, some got simplified, but the core remained true. Two desperate people had found each other across impossible distance and built something that lasted. On the day Lillian signed those papers in Boston, shaking with hunger and fear, she'd thought she was trading freedom for survival. She'd believed she was giving up her own story to become part of someone else's. She'd been wrong. What she'd actually done was take the biggest gamble of her life. She'd bet everything on a stranger, on a harsh land, on the possibility that she could become someone stronger than the woman who'd boarded that train. And against all odds, impossibly, miraculously, she'd won. Not because the path had been easy, not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because when the hard moments came, and they kept coming year after year, she'd chosen to stay, to fight, to build instead of breaking. The ranch stood as proof of that choice. Every fence post, every building, every acre of land told the story of two people who refused to quit on each other or on the life they were building together. Standing on her porch decades later, watching her grandchildren play in the yard where she'd once shot a man to save her husband's life, Lillian understood something fundamental about survival and strength and love. The frontier didn't care about your past or your fears or your careful plans. It just kept coming at you with everything it had. Weather and violence and crushing loneliness and moments of unbearable beauty all mixed together. The only way to survive it was to find someone worth surviving for. Someone who'd stand with you when standing meant everything. She'd found that person on a frozen platform in a town that wanted nothing to do with him. She'd married him knowing almost nothing except that he'd been honest when he could have lied. And that honesty, that fundamental respect for her right to know what she was choosing, had been the foundation of everything good that followed. The greatest gamble of her life had become the greatest love she'd ever known. Not the soft, easy love of fairy tales, but the hard-won kind that came from choosing each other again and again, even when the choice was difficult. Especially when the choice was difficult. That was the lesson the frontier had taught her. That was the truth she'd carry until her last breath. Love wasn't something that just happened to you. It was something you built, deliberately, stubbornly, with your own scarred hands and imperfect heart. And if you were very lucky, very brave, and very stubborn, you built something that lasted, something worth fighting for, something worth everything.